Blood flowed into rivers within the entire gorge. The rays of the setting sun seemed blood-red as they made the blood that tainted the gorge to become more prominent, and it seemed as if only one color remained within the entire world, and it was a dazzling and resplendent scarlet red. Unknowingly, the commotion and shrill cries had already vanished. A group of demonic Lotus Blade sect disciples stood within the gorge with terrified expressions as they looked at the four figures in the sky that were like gods of slaughter, and their legs seemed as if they were filled with lead, causing it to be difficult to move in the slightest. They didn't dare flee, because they knew they were unable. Perhaps they had the chance of escaping death if they stood here. As the wind blew by, an extremely dense smell of blood pierced into their nostrils, causing their expressions to go pale, and their bodies shivered. Suddenly, a figure descended from the sky. This was a young man whose clothes were completely tainted with blood, and the sword within his hand was still dripping with blood, causing him to seem like a peerless god of slaughter. The demonic Lotus Blade sect disciples went ghastly pale when they saw the young man in bloodied clothes approaching. It was precisely this person that had wiped out the three great sect leaders of their demonic Lotus Blade sect, and the other few 6th level Void Initiation stage Guardian Elders had died one by one at his hands as well. The other elders and the senior disciples of the sect had all died at the hands of the companions by this young man's side. Duan Ling Tian stood at a low altitude in the air above the gorge, and he looked down upon the survivors of the demonic Lotus Blade sect. Feng Tianwu and Qin Xiang followed like a shadow behind him, whereas, the rock even followed by his side and ceaselessly flapped his wings that were like clouds that covered the sky, as his sharp eyes stared at the remaining demonic Lotus Blade sect disciples. All of you that were already disciples of the demonic Lotus Blade sect, Origin Convergence sect, and Snow Moon sect before the Azure Forest Tri-sect annihilated my 7-star sword sect, stand out from the group. Duan Ling Tian spoke indifferently, and his voice seemed calm, yet actually contained killing intent. As soon as Duan Ling Tian finished speaking, many people went ghastly pale. These people were already members of the demonic Lotus Blade sect, Origin Convergence sect, and Snow Moon sect 5 years ago, and some of them had even participated in the annihilation of the 7-star sword sect. Now when Duan Ling Tian asked them to step out, they were naturally able to guess what intentions Duan Ling Tian held. So none of them dared stand out. 10 breaths of time. I'll give all of you 10 breaths of time. Duan Ling Tian continued. If no one stands out after 10 breaths of time, then all of you will die. When his calm words entered into the ears of the demonic Lotus Blade sect disciples, and it was like a voodoo chant that caused their faces to go pale. For a time, the demonic Lotus Blade sect disciples were in disorder. A disciple that joined the Azure Forest Trisect later on pointed towards another person by his side and said, "I know you. You were already a Snow Moon sect disciple before the Seven-Star Sword sect was annihilated. Go out quickly, don't get all of us killed." Instantly, it drew public outrage. Go out. Go out, quickly. For a time, this person became a common target of everyone, and in the end, he walked out of the crowd with long face and stood alone outside. There's still another 7 breaths of time. Duan Ling Tian continued. I remember you as well. You were an Origin Convergence sect disciple 5 years ago. Get out. You, get out. 4 years ago, when I'd just arrived at the Azure Forest Trisect, you were flaunting before me about how many 7-star sword sect disciples you killed. In next to no time, almost 100 people were pushed out from the crowd of demonic Lotus Blade sect disciples, whereas, the countenance of the almost 100 people were extremely pale, and as they stood outside the crowd, their bodies shivered as if they had already guessed their fate. The time of 10 breaths is up. Duan Ling Tian's gaze descended onto the almost 100 people that were pushed out, and the billowing killing intent on his body swept out to envelop them. Instantly, the expressions of these people went deathly pale. Duan Ling Tian, don't kill me. Don't kill me. Even though I was a Snow Moon sect disciple since long ago, but I didn't head over to the 7-star sword sect on that day. Me too. I've never been to the 7-star sword sect. Spare me. More than half of the almost 100 people that were pushed out started speaking out in panic with pleas of injustice. But Duan Ling Tian utterly paid no attention to them. At this moment, he would rather kill someone wrongly than let anyone off. Otherwise, he would let down the numerous souls of the deceased from the 7-star sword sect. Whoosh. Mou, who'd been watching the events since the beginning, had descended to Duan Ling Tian's side at this moment. Senior brother, leave them to me. Duan Ling Tian didn't refuse Mou's offer to undertake the task at hand. Go ahead. He knew clearly in his heart that Mou was unable to endure since long ago. When they made a move to deal with the higher UPS and void prying stage disciples of the demonic Lotus Blade sect, he'd once send a voice transmission to restrict Mou from joining in the battle, as he wouldn't allow anything to happen to Mou. Mou was the future hope of the 7-star sword sect. Presently, the almost 100 demonic Lotus Blade sect disciples before him were martial artists that hadn't even stepped into the void prying stage, so they were incapable of posing any threat to Mou. Mou ought to vent his feelings now. Mou's eyes lit up when he obtained Duan Ling Tian's permission, and a spirit sword appeared in his hand as he flashed out like a shooting star that descended towards the demonic Lotus Blade sect disciples. 7-star sword technique. MOU directly executed the sect-guarding sword skill of the 7-star sword sect, and 7 material sword lights whistled out to kill 7 demonic Lotus Blade sect disciples in the blink of an eye. As the closed-door disciple of the former 7-star sword sect's leader, Ling Hujinhong, and coupled with Duan Ling Tian being not inclined to take the position of sect leader, Ling Hujinhong had fostered MOU as the next sect leader of the 7-star sword sect long ago. When Ling Hujinhong had passed the minor 7-star sword technique to MOU, he'd already passed the 7-star sword technique to MOU as well. MOU didn't disappoint Ling Hujinhong's high hopes, and had smoothly cultivated the 7-star sword technique to the mastery stage under the guidance of Qin Xiang during these past few years. Swish. 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 Along with MOU attacking, 7 sword lights formed into a group that flashed out as if it had transformed into the scythe of the god of death, and every single sword light took the life of a demonic Lotus Blade sect disciple. The crowd of demonic Lotus Blade sect disciples either fought MOU with their lives or flew for their lives, yet none of them were capable of escaping the same fate. In a short amount of time, the almost 100 demonic Lotus Blade sect disciples that were well and living had fallen to the ground, causing blood to flow into rivers. Thump. Under the gazes of everyone present, MOU knelt on the ground that was tainted in blood as 2 streams of tears flowed from his eyes, and he looked up into the western sky as he said with a loud voice, "Master, are you watching? I've taken revenge for you and taken revenge for all the peak masters, elders, and senior and junior brothers and sisters. All of you can rest in peace in the afterlife." After he finished speaking, MOU made 3 resounding kowtows on the ground before standing up once again. "All of the remaining people must establish a vow with your blood. If any of you had joined the demonic Lotus Blade sect, Snow Moon sect, or Origin Convergence sect 5 years ago, then you'll be blasted to death by the 99 heavenly tribulation." Duan Ling Tian's fierce gaze descended onto all the remaining demonic Lotus Blade sect disciples as he spoke with a low voice. Instantly, many people in the group of demonic Lotus Blade sect disciples went pale. These people were disciples that had joined the 3 great sects 5 years ago, yet they didn't take step out themselves earlier, nor did the surrounding demonic Lotus Blade sect disciples know of their history, so they'd escaped the earlier calamity. They thought that they would be able to survive, yet never had they imagined that Duan Ling Tian would be so vigilant and ask them to establish a vow under the 99 heavenly tribulation. Of course, some people held hopes of being lucky in their hearts, and they felt that establishing a vow was nothing great. Even though the 99 heavenly tribulation was the publicly acknowledged oath tribulation of Cloud Continent, but the 99 heavenly tribulation was only an illusory legend to most people. They didn't think that an oath tribulation could do anything to them, whereas, these people quickly found out how naive their thinking was. Along with numerous drops of blood charging into the sky and numerous vows escaping the mouths of the remaining demonic Lotus Blade sect disciples, waves of continuous thunderclaps sounded out in the horizon. The thunderclaps grew in frequency and seemed like firecrackers. As soon as all the demonic Lotus Blade sect disciples finished speaking, balls of dark clouds condensed at the horizon, and they arrived in the sky above the gorge in a short moment before ceaselessly converging together. Violet-colored bolts of lightning surged and crackled ceaselessly atop the balls of dark clouds, and it seemed as if it was brewing something. Punishment lightning clouds have descended. Many people are going to be struck with misfortune. Elder Kong, who saw the scene from high up in the air, couldn't help but shake his head and smile. Brother Duan is really intelligent. He even knows to use this method to determine if there are any people in the remaining group of demonic Lotus Blade sect disciples that avoided being killed earlier. Now, he didn't even have to make a move himself against those people that avoided death earlier. The son-in-law of Feng Wu Dao, is naturally no ordinary person. Feng Wu Dao spoke indifferently. His words seemed as if Duan Ling Tian had already married Feng Tianwu and officially became his son-in-law. Bang! 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 Numerous tribulation lightning bolts that were thick as a bucket tore through the sky as they descended towards the demonic Lotus Blade sect disciples that avoided death earlier before blasting them into ash, and it wiped out any trace of them in this world. At the moment of death, only a single thought remained in the minds of these demonic Lotus Blade sect disciples. The oath tribulation of legend is real. If anyone dared to be hopeful while vowing before the oath tribulation, then that person would die for sure. The remaining group of demonic Lotus Blade sect disciples went pale when they saw over 10 fellow disciples being struck into ash, and some with low mental endurance even fell limply and started shivering on the ground. The scene from before was enough to become a nightmare for their entire lifetimes. Over 10 bolts of tribulation lightning that were thick as a bucket descended right before them, and it blasted the living people by their sides earlier into ash. The legends are true. A person that goes against the oath made under the heavenly tribulation will indeed be blasted to death by the 99 heavenly tribulation. Looks like they were being hopeful when they made the vow earlier. The remaining few hundreds of demonic Lotus Blade sect disciples whispered in discussions, and their words were filled with fear towards the oath tribulation. All of you. FK off. Duan Lingtian glanced indifferently at the remaining demonic Lotus Blade sect disciples as he spoke indifferently. Even though he'd killed many people, but he'd killed people that deserved death. Killing these hundreds of demonic Lotus Blade sect disciples was as easy as a flip of the hand to Duan Lingtian, yet Duan Lingtian didn't do it. These demonic Lotus Blade sect disciples weren't disciples of the Azure Forest Tri-sect that had participated in the battle 5 years ago that annihilated the 7-Star Sword sect, so they didn't deserve death. As soon as Duan Lingtian finished speaking and when the crowd of demonic Lotus Blade sect disciples hadn't recovered from their shock, there were 2 demonic Lotus Blade sect disciples that were the first to recover from their shock, and they glanced at each other before kneeling on the ground and speaking respectfully. Lord Duan Lingtian, we want to join the 7-Star Sword sect.